It started as an ordinary Thursday. I woke up to the soft hum of the alarm, the room bathed in the pale gray of early morning. My husband was already up, moving through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The scent of fresh coffee wafted through the hallway, mingling with the crisp autumn air that slipped through the cracked bedroom window. It was a scene so familiar, so comfortable, that I barely noticed the hollowness beneath it. I dressed quickly, my hands moving on autopilot through the motions of makeup and hair, choosing a blouse and skirt that felt safe. Professional. I had a full day of meetings ahead, a stack of emails waiting for replies, and yet a part of me felt detached from it all, as if I were an actor playing a role I no longer understood. I took a final glance in the mirror, adjusting the collar of my blouse, my reflection staring back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Was it longing? Was it fatigue? I couldn't tell. The morning commute was a blur of brake lights and talk radio. I parked my car in the lot outside the office building, a nondescript structure of glass and steel that seemed to swallow the weak sunlight. I made my way inside, nodding to familiar faces, offering small smiles that never quite reached my eyes. The routine swallowed me whole and I let it. And then it happened. I had just picked up a few things at the grocery store during my lunch break. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, nothing special. As I reached for a jar on the top shelf, a hand appeared above mine. Need a hand? The voice was warm with a hint of amusement. I turned and there he was, my boss. His presence felt too large for the narrow aisle, his smile too genuine in the harsh fluorescent light. Thank you, I managed, stepping back as he lowered the jar into my cart. Our fingers brushed, a brief, innocuous contact that sent a small, unexpected shiver through me. I tried to hide it, focusing on the contents of my cart as if they held the answers to questions I didn't dare ask. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, still holding the jar as if unwilling to break the moment. You live nearby? Not far, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Just picking up a few things. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. Well, I won't keep you. See you back at the office. As he walked away, I stood there, my feet rooted to the spot. It was a simple interaction, nothing out of the ordinary, and yet it left an echo in its wake. On the drive back to the office, his face remained in my thoughts, an uninvited guest in the quiet of my mind. The afternoon dragged. Every email, every phone call felt like a thin veil over the drumbeat of my thoughts. I found myself glancing at his office door, half expecting him to walk in, to continue our conversation, to say something, anything, that would make sense of the fluttering in my chest. But he didn't. And when 5 o'clock rolled around, I gathered my things and left, slipping back into the rhythm of my life as if nothing had changed. But that night, as I lay next to my husband in the dark, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. His breathing was slow and steady, a metronome to my restless thoughts. I stared at the ceiling, the room bathed in shadows, and tried to will myself into sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the curve of his smile, the warmth in his voice, the way his hand had lingered on that jar. I told myself it was nothing. A momentary lapse, a harmless thought. And yet, as the night dragged on, I felt something shift inside me, a subtle, almost imperceptible crack in the surface of my world. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew enough to be afraid of where it might lead. The next day at the office, everything felt sharper, as if the world had been turned up a notch. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, the clicking of keyboards seemed to echo, and every whispered conversation felt like it was meant for my ears. I moved through the motions of my tasks, but my mind was elsewhere, still tangled in the brief encounter at the grocery store, replaying the brush of his hand against mine. It was a small moment, barely a spark, but it smoldered quietly beneath my skin. I managed to avoid him for most of the morning, keeping my head down, eyes glued to my screen. I responded to emails, reviewed documents, but every so often I found my gaze drifting to his office door. It remained closed, the frosted glass obscuring any view of him. I told myself it was for the best. The rational part of me knew that. But beneath that logic, something more primal stirred. A quiet ache, a sense of incompleteness that gnawed at me. When the clock struck 5, the office began to empty. People drifted toward the elevators in clusters, their laughter and goodbyes filling the quiet space. I lingered at my desk, telling myself I needed to finish one last report, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to go home. The thought of returning to the familiar walls of my house, to the quiet routine of dinner and muted conversation, filled me with a dull kind of dread. Still here. His voice broke the silence and I jumped, my heart thudding against my ribs. I looked up to find him standing at the edge of my cubicle, his hands in his pockets, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and concern. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just finishing up." He nodded, a small, thoughtful gesture. "I'm heading out too. Need a ride?" I hesitated, the word no balanced on the tip of my tongue. But instead I heard myself say, "That would be great, thank you." We walked to his car in the dimming light, our footsteps soft against the concrete of the parking garage. His car was immaculate, the leather seats cool against my skin as I settled in. The silence between us was both comfortable and charged, a thin thread pulled taut between us. He started the engine, the soft hum of music filling the space around us. As we pulled out onto the street, the sky opened up. Fat drops of rain splattered against the windshield, and he switched on the wipers, their rhythmic swish blending with the soft jazz on the radio. I watched the city blur behind a curtain of rain, the world outside slipping away, leaving just the small cocoon of his car. Traffic slowed to a crawl and he sighed, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. "Looks like we might be here a while." I nodded, my voice caught somewhere in my throat. My hands twisted together in my lap, the cool metal of my wedding ring pressing against my skin. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but words felt slippery, just out of reach. He turned to me, his eyes soft in the dim light. "You okay?" The question hung between us, simple yet loaded. I nodded again, but my expression must have betrayed me because he reached over, his hand brushing against mine. His touch was gentle, his fingers warm against my cold skin. It was such a small thing, so easy to dismiss, but the weight of it settled deep in my chest. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I turned toward him. His face was so close, his expression unreadable. I felt the air shift, the space between us narrowing, and then his lips were on mine. Soft, searching, hesitant. It was not a kiss of passion but of curiosity, a question asked in the quiet of the storm. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, to remember the life I had built, the promises I had made. But my body betrayed me, leaning into him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin, and I felt something inside me crack open, a dam breaking under the weight of its own silence. The moment stretched, each heartbeat a reminder of the line we were crossing. And then just as quickly it ended. I pulled back, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. His eyes searched mine, a mix of concern and something else. Something raw and unspoken. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't respond, just sat back in his seat, his hand still lingering near me, a tether to the reality we had just shattered. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm against the glass, as if the world had not noticed the shift in gravity inside that car. When the traffic finally cleared, he drove me home in silence. The warmth of his hand still lingered on my skin, a ghost of a touch that refused to fade. I thanked him quietly as I stepped out of the car, my voice small and fragile. He nodded, his expression closed off, and I watched as his taillights disappeared into the night. I stood on the porch for a long time, the cool rain seeping into my clothes. My husband's car was in the driveway, the porch light casting a soft glow over the wet pavement. I knew I should go inside, wipe the rain from my skin, fold myself back into the life I had always known. But my feet remained rooted to the spot, my mind tangled in the memory of a kiss that had felt like a doorway to another world. When I finally turned the key in the lock, the house greeted me with its familiar stillness. My husband was in the living room, the soft glow of the television casting shadows across his face. He looked up, offered a tired smile, and returned to his show. I mumbled a greeting, my voice barely more than a whisper, and slipped into the bathroom. In the mirror I saw a woman I did not recognize. Her lips were still swollen, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes, my eyes, held a secret I was not ready to face. I wiped away the rain, the smudged makeup, the evidence of a life that had begun to unravel. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I could not wash away the weight of his touch, the taste of his kiss, the quiet hum of possibility that lingered in the back of my mind. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft, steady breathing of my husband beside me, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, a careful dance between the familiar and the forbidden. I moved through my routines as if nothing had changed, my actions smooth and practiced, but beneath the surface, everything felt jagged. The memory of his lips on mine lingered, a quiet hum at the back of my mind, coloring every interaction, every thought. I tried to bury it, to push it into the shadows of my mind, but it was like holding back the tide. At the office I avoided him. I took longer routes through the hallways, buried myself in work and kept my head down. The few times I did see him, our interactions were brief and painfully normal. He asked for a report, I handed it to him. He nodded in thanks and I nodded back. It was a game we played, this pretense of normalcy, but each nod, each glance felt like another thread pulling tight around us. One afternoon I found myself alone in the break room. The coffee pot gurgled softly, filling the air with the bitter scent of burnt grounds. I wrapped my hands around a mug, letting the warmth seep into my skin, but it did nothing to ease the cold knot in my chest. I had managed to avoid him for most of the week, but the effort of it had left me exhausted. I felt like a ghost, drifting through my own life, barely touching the ground. The door swung open and I didn't need to look up to know it was him. His presence filled the room, a quiet shift in the air, and I felt my body tense, every muscle coiled and ready to run. He moved to the coffee pot, his movements slow and deliberate. I focused on my mug, the swirl of dark liquid, the way the light caught the rim. Anything but him. Are you avoiding me? His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I hesitated, the truth tangled in my throat. No. Just busy. He nodded, pouring his coffee, his back to me. The silence stretched, each second a thin wire pulling tight between us. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. His words were careful, each one placed with precision. I wanted to believe him, to take the out he was offering, but I knew it wasn't that simple. You didn't. I need some space. He turned then, his eyes searching mine. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a quiet understanding that made my chest ache. I get it. I'll back off. I wanted to thank him, to say something that would ease the tightness between us, but the words slipped away, leaving only silence. He left the room, his coffee forgotten, and I was alone again, the air too thin, my skin too tight. That evening a storm rolled in. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds pressing low over the city. I stayed late, using the excuse of unfinished work to avoid going home. The office was empty, the soft hum of the lights the only sound. I welcomed the solitude, letting it wrap around me like a blanket. But the storm had other plans. The rain came in sheets, hammering against the windows, and when I finally gathered my things to leave, I found the street outside flooded. The parking lot was a maze of dark water, the exit road blocked by emergency vehicles. I was trapped. He found me by the window, my hands pressed against the cold glass. Looks like we're stuck here, he said, his voice low. I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the swirling water outside. The world had become a blur, rain and shadows merging into a single unbroken expanse. His presence beside me was a weight, pulling me down, grounding me in a reality I wasn't sure I wanted to face. He sat down on the edge of a desk, his posture relaxed as if we were simply passing the time. Ever been in a flood before? I shook my head. No. You. Once. Years ago. Ended up spending the night in a gym with 100 other people. Not exactly a good time. His attempt at lightness fell flat, but I appreciated it. I turned to face him, the room dim and soft around us. I didn't mean to make things weird between us. His expression softened, a small, sad smile touching his lips. We're both adults. We made a choice. It doesn't have to define us. But it does, I said quietly. It already has. He didn't argue. Instead he reached into his bag, pulling out a small bottle of water, offering it to me. I took it, our fingers brushing, and it was enough to send a ripple through the stillness between us. I wanted to pull away, to keep the distance I had fought so hard to create, but I was so tired of fighting. We talked then, not about us but about everything else. He told me about his first job, a summer spent cleaning pools, the way the chlorine had turned his hair brittle and his skin dry. I told him about the small town I had grown up in, the summers spent at the lake, the sound of cicadas in the heat. Our words built a bridge over the quiet, a narrow, fragile path that led us somewhere softer. When the rain finally eased, the world outside a maze of puddles and slick streets, we stood together by the door. The air between us felt different, the sharp edges worn down by shared stories and the quiet truth that neither of us wanted to speak. As we stepped into the damp night, I felt a sense of loss, a small, sharp ache that lodged itself beneath my ribs. He offered to drive me home, but I declined. I needed the rain, the cool drops on my skin, the long walk to clear my head. He nodded, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer than they should have, and then he was gone, his silhouette swallowed by the mist. I walked home, the city a blur of wet light and empty streets. The rain soaked through my clothes, clung to my skin, but it felt good, real, grounding. Each step was an echo, a reminder that I was still here, still moving, still caught in the delicate space between what was and what might be. When I reached my front door, I paused, my hand on the handle. Inside, my husband would be waiting, his routine as steady as ever. I took a breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapping around me. But beneath that warmth, a cold thread lingered, winding tight around my heart, a reminder that the flood had only just begun. The days bled into each other, each one a mirror of the last. My life settled into a fragile rhythm: wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. The kiss, the storm, the quiet intimacy of that night in the office. Each memory settled under my skin, a constant itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to focus on my marriage, to redirect the energy coiling inside me into something safe, something familiar. But familiarity had become my prison, and I was only just starting to see the bars. My husband noticed in his own quiet way. He never asked direct questions, he never did, but his eyes lingered on me a second too long, his silences stretching into spaces I couldn't fill. I cooked his favorite meals, wore the dresses he once complimented, even initiated intimacy in the dim light of our bedroom. He responded, his touch gentle, his kisses warm, but it was like holding smoke. Nothing stuck. The warmth I craved slipped through my fingers, leaving only the chill of what wasn't there. One evening I decided to change things. I planned a dinner, something spontaneous, something to remind us both of who we had been before life settled around us like dust. I lit candles, chose music with soft melodies, and wore a dress that had once made him look twice. The kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, the table set with our best plates. It felt almost ritualistic, each movement deliberate, a quiet offering to the gods of second chances. When he came home, his shoulders slumped with the weight of another long day, he hesitated in the doorway. His expression shifted, surprise, confusion, then something like caution. He set down his bag, his hands lingering on the strap as if he needed the anchor. "What's all this?" I smoothed my dress, the fabric cool under my fingers. "I thought it might be nice to have a proper dinner together. Just us." He nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the room, the candles, the soft glow of the lamp in the corner. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble." "It's not trouble," I said, and my voice sounded too bright, too sharp against the gentle hum of the music. We sat across from each other, the candlelight drawing shadows over his face. He asked about my day and I answered, our conversation a careful dance around the silence that had grown between us. I found myself watching him as if he were a stranger, noting the small lines around his eyes, the way his hair had thinned just slightly at the temples. These were changes I had not seen happen, evidence of a life we had built together, and yet I felt a million miles away. He reached for his glass, his fingers brushing the stem, and I thought of the way my boss's hand had felt against mine. The thought hit me like cold water, a shock to the system. I pushed it away, focusing on the man in front of me, the man who had been my constant, my safe place for so many years. But the effort of it was exhausting, and by the time dessert came, my smile felt brittle, ready to crack. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, his arm draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin. The television played quietly in the background, a murmur of voices that neither of us listened to. His hand moved to my neck, a slow, familiar gesture, and I turned to him, offering a soft kiss, an invitation. He responded, his touch gentle, his lips warm, but there was a distance between us, a gap neither of us could bridge. As the night wore on, we found our way to the bedroom. I went through the motions, my body moving in time with his, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of what-ifs and maybes. His hands on my skin felt like a question I couldn't answer, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. When it was over, he drifted to sleep, his breathing steady, his arm a weight across my waist. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with the weight of my own silence. The next morning I dressed with more care than usual. I chose a blouse that hugged my figure, a skirt with a subtle slit, heels that added just enough height to make me feel like someone else. My makeup was careful, every stroke deliberate, a mask I could hide behind. I told myself it was for me, that I needed the confidence, the sense of control, but I knew better. I wanted him to notice. I wanted his eyes on me, the quiet hum of his attention filling the empty spaces inside me. At the office, I found myself lingering by his door, my fingers trailing along the edge of the frame. He looked up, his expression softening when he saw me. There was no pretense between us, no need for careful words or guarded glances. It was a relief. A reminder that beneath the layers of what we couldn't say there was still something real. He asked me to join him for coffee, a casual suggestion, but I heard the undercurrent, felt the pulse of possibility. We sat in the corner of a small cafe, the hum of conversation around us a buffer against the world. His hand rested on the table, fingers splayed, and I wanted to reach out, to lace my fingers with his, to let the world around us dissolve into nothing. That we talked. About work, about life, about everything except the truth that sat between us like a stone. His eyes held mine, his expression open, and I felt the ache in my chest ease, the tightness unwinding just a little. When it was time to leave, he stood close to me, his hand brushing against my back, a small, steadying touch. I leaned into it just for a moment, letting myself feel the warmth of him, the solidness of his presence. As I walked back to the office, the cool breeze tugging at my hair, I felt a flicker of something like hope. It was dangerous, I knew that, but it was also the first real thing I had felt in a long time. And as I sat back at my desk, my fingers grazing the edge of the coffee cup he had handed me, I knew that this story was far from over. I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, as if the air around me had thickened overnight. The previous evening lingered in my mind, tangled in the sheets and woven into the dim light filtering through the window. My husband had already left for work, his side of the bed cool and undisturbed. I lay there for a moment, the quiet pressing down on me, the weight of everything unsaid pulling me under. I moved through my morning routine in a haze. Each step felt disconnected, my reflection in the mirror a stranger's face. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, the softness of my skin dulled by shadows. I applied my makeup slowly, each brushstroke an attempt to cover the cracks in my composure. When I chose my clothes, I reached for something that felt different. Something that made me feel seen, if only by my own eyes. At the office, the day unfolded with a kind of restless energy. I immersed myself in work, letting the familiar rhythm of emails and meetings lull me into a false sense of stability. But every time I heard his voice, every time his shadow crossed my periphery, the air seemed to shift. It was subtle, a barely perceptible change, but it was enough to keep my pulse quickened, my skin prickling with awareness. We hadn't spoken much since the storm. Our interactions had been polite, professional, a carefully constructed wall between us. But walls have cracks, and through those cracks I felt the quiet thrum of everything we weren't saying. His glances lingered, his words held a softness that no one else seemed to notice. It was a language only we spoke, a private dialect of half smiles and quiet pauses. That afternoon, as the office began to empty, he appeared at my desk. His expression was unreadable, his voice steady. "Do you have a minute?" I nodded, my fingers stilling over the keyboard. "Sure." He led me to his office, the door closing behind us with a soft click. The room felt smaller with just the two of us, the air charged and still. He moved to his desk, but he didn't sit. Instead, he stood by the window, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. I remained near the door, the handle cool against my palm, a lifeline to the world outside. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for everything. I never meant to complicate things for you." I swallowed, the motion tight and uncomfortable. "It's not just you. I'm as much a part of this as you are." His shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. "I know. But I need to make sure you're okay. I don't want you to feel pressured or—" "I don't," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I expected. "It's not that simple." He turned to face me, his expression open, vulnerable. "Then what is it?" I searched for the words, but they slipped through my fingers, leaving only the raw truth behind. "I don't know. I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something, and I don't know if I should step forward or run. He took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. You don't have to decide anything right now. We can just be honest with each other. No expectations. I nodded, a small, cautious gesture. His presence filled the room, the space between us narrowing with each breath. I felt the pull of him, the quiet gravity that had been drawing me in since the first brush of his hand against mine. My back pressed against the door, the cool metal grounding me, but it wasn't enough to stop the ache that had settled deep inside me. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, a question asked without words. I hesitated, the silence thick around us, and then I closed the distance. His fingers curled around mine, warm and steady, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a small, tender motion, and I leaned into it, letting the moment envelop me. When his lips met mine, it was soft, unhurried. There was no urgency, no rush, just the quiet exchange of breath, the gentle press of skin against skin. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch light as if he were afraid I might disappear. I closed my eyes, letting the world outside the door fade into nothing, leaving only the warmth of his body, the steadiness of his heartbeat. We pulled away slowly, our foreheads touching, his breath warm against my skin. I don't want to hurt you, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that settled deep in my chest. You're not, I whispered back. I'm already broken. You're just helping me find the pieces. We stood like that for a moment, the room holding its breath around us. His hand remained on my cheek, his thumb tracing slow circles, a quiet promise in the stillness. I wanted to stay there, to let the moment stretch on forever, but reality pressed against the edges of my mind, a reminder of everything waiting just outside the door. When we finally stepped apart, the space between us felt too wide. I straightened my blouse, my fingers brushing over the fabric, the lingering warmth of his touch still on my skin. He opened the door, his expression slipping back into professionalism, and I followed him into the hallway, our movements practiced, a performance for the watching world. As I returned to my desk, the glow of my computer screen felt harsh, the fluorescent lights too bright. I sat down, my fingers hovering over the keys, but the words on the screen blurred, slipping out of focus. I could still feel the imprint of his lips on mine, the soft press of his hand against my cheek. It was a ghost of a touch, a whisper against my skin, but it held more weight than I was ready to carry. That evening, as I walked to my car, the sky had turned a deep, bruised blue. The air was cool, the breeze tugging at my hair, and I let it wash over me, hoping it might clear the haze in my mind. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands on the wheel, and stared at the dashboard, the quiet tick of the engine a metronome to my racing thoughts. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I sat there, the parking lot empty around me, and let the weight of the day settle over me. My phone buzzed with a message from my husband, something mundane, a reminder about groceries, and I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. But beneath it, threading through the ache, was something else. Something warm, something alive. And as I finally pulled out of the lot, the taillights casting long shadows in the fading light, I knew that the path ahead was anything but clear. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the pull of the unknown, the quiet thrill of not knowing where the road might lead. In the days that followed, my life became a balancing act, a tightrope walk between two worlds. At home, I played my part with practiced ease. I moved through the routines of marriage, each step measured and careful. I made dinner, shared small talk over the hum of the television, and lay beside my husband in the quiet of our bedroom. His presence was a constant, a steady rhythm against the chaos inside me. But every smile, every touch felt like a performance, the warmth of it muted by the secrets I carried. At the office, everything was different. I felt the pulse of our connection beneath every mundane exchange, a quiet current that hummed between us. He never pushed, never crossed the line when others were around, but in the quiet moments, when our paths crossed in the empty hallway or our hands brushed as he handed me a document, I felt it. It was a spark, a reminder that beneath the layers of professionalism lay something raw and unspoken. I found myself lingering at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. The hum of the lights, the soft click of my keyboard, these became the backdrop to my unraveling. I told myself I was working late, catching up on tasks, but the truth was simpler. I was waiting. Waiting for him to pass by, for his shadow to slip across my door, for a reason to keep the world outside at bay. One evening, as the office settled into the stillness of twilight, He left a small box on my desk. It was simple, wrapped in brown paper with a neat white ribbon. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers grazing the smooth edge of the bow. Inside lay a delicate pendant, a silver charm shaped like a leaf, its surface etched with fine, intricate lines. It was beautiful, understated, thoughtful, a quiet echo of the things he couldn't say. I wore it the next day, the cool metal resting against my skin, a secret hidden beneath the fabric of my blouse. It felt like a tether, a reminder that somewhere beneath the layers of my life, a different story was unfolding. His eyes caught on the necklace when he saw me, a quick glance, a slight curve of his lips, but nothing more. The unspoken acknowledgement sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the fine line we walked. At home I kept the pendant tucked beneath my clothes, a secret against my skin. My husband never noticed, his gaze sliding over me with the comfort of familiarity. He asked me once if everything was okay, his voice soft, his brow creased with concern. I told him I was fine, just tired from work, and he accepted it without question. His trust was a weight around my neck, heavier than the silver charm, pulling me under. My dreams became tangled with reality. I would wake in the early hours, the room draped in shadows, my skin warm and my breath uneven. I felt his touch in the dark, the brush of his fingers against my cheek, the whisper of his lips against my ear. But when I reached out, it was my husband beside me, his form solid and familiar. I would lie still, my body caught between the comfort of what was and the ache of what could be. The weekend brought a kind of reprieve. My husband suggested a day trip. A drive to the coast, lunch by the water, a chance to reconnect. I agreed, my voice bright, my smile wide, but inside I felt hollow. The idea of spending hours alone with him, the weight of his expectation pressing against my chest, left me breathless. I went through the motions, packing a bag, choosing a dress that he liked, applying my makeup with careful strokes. I wanted to be the woman he saw, the wife he thought he knew, but each layer felt like a mask, a thin veneer over the truth. We drove in silence, the road winding through the hills, the sky a wash of pale blue. He held my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over my skin, but I felt nothing. His touch was a reminder of the distance between us, the chasm that had opened beneath our feet. When we reached the coast, the sea air was sharp, biting against my skin, but I welcomed the sting. It made me feel real, grounded, the salt and wind a brief escape from the tangle inside me. We sat by the water, the waves a steady rhythm, and he talked about the future. Trips we might take, plans for the house, the life he saw stretching out before us. I nodded, my responses automatic, my mind 1,000 miles away. I watched the waves, the way they rolled in, relentless and unyielding, erasing the marks left behind by those who had walked before. I envied their simplicity, their certainty. My life felt like the sand beneath them, shifting, unstable, the ground giving way beneath my feet. That night, back at home, I stood in the bathroom, the cool tiles underfoot, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back, eyes shadowed, lips pressed into a thin line. I reached for the pendant, drawing it out from beneath my blouse, the silver leaf catching the light. It hung there, a quiet reminder of the choices I had made, the path I was walking. I let it rest against my skin, the metal cool, a contrast to the heat that had settled deep inside me. When I returned to the bedroom, my husband was already asleep. His form lay still beneath the covers, his breathing slow and even. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to disturb him, and stared at the ceiling. The room was dark, the only sound the soft rustle of the sheets as I shifted beneath them. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I saw his face, not my husband's but his. The man who had given me the pendant, who had filled the empty spaces with quiet warmth and stolen moments. As sleep pulled me under, I felt the weight of the necklace against my skin, a reminder of the secret life I held close, a fragile thing, delicate and dangerous. And in the quiet of the night, I let myself drift, carried by the current of everything I couldn't say, everything I couldn't feel, and everything I wasn't ready to let go. The message arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, slipping into my inbox like a whisper. At first glance, it seemed like any other email. A forwarded thread from a colleague, the subject line vague and unassuming. I opened it between meetings, expecting another mundane update, but as my eyes moved over the text, a cold weight settled in my chest. I know about you and him. The words were sharp, slicing through the thin veneer of normalcy I had constructed around myself. There was no name, no signature, just those 6 words hanging in the white space like a noose. My fingers tightened around the mouse, the plastic biting into my skin. The room around me blurred, the hum of the office fading into a distant drone. I read the message again, hoping it might change, that I had misread, that it was some sort of mistake. But it was there, unyielding, a quiet threat wrapped in anonymity. I forced myself to breathe, each inhale a struggle against the tightness in my chest. My mind raced, pulling at threads, trying to find the loose end that had led here. Had someone seen us? Had I left a trace, a breadcrumb leading back to the truth? The walls of the office seemed to close in, each glance from a colleague a potential accusation. I closed the email, my movements slow and deliberate, a thin layer of ice over the panic beneath. I moved through the rest of the day in a fog, my body on autopilot. Every sound felt amplified. The click of keys, the ring of phones, the murmur of voices. I felt exposed, raw, as if the skin had been peeled back to reveal the nerve endings beneath. When the office began to empty, I stayed at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keys. I wanted to write back, to demand answers, but fear held me still. I didn't know who was watching, who might be waiting for me to slip. The idea of my secret being laid bare, of my life unraveling in the cold light of an email, left me breathless. A soft knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. He stood there, his expression open, his presence a balm against the tightness in my chest. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my response automatic. "Just a long day." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of it clicking shut was a comfort, a barrier between us and the world outside. "You seem off." "I'm fine," I said, but my voice wavered, the crack in it impossible to hide. His eyes narrowed, a line appearing between his brows. He moved closer, his hand brushing mine as he leaned against the desk. The contact was brief but grounding, pulling me back from the edge. "You can talk to me," he said, his tone gentle. "Whatever it is." I wanted to tell him. To open the email, show him the words, share the weight of the fear pressing down on me. But I couldn't. The risk was too great, the stakes too high. Instead, I forced a smile, the muscles in my face tight. "It's nothing. Just tired." He didn't push. He never did. It was one of the things I both loved and hated about him. The way he gave me space, trusted me to find my own way. But in that moment, I needed him to see through me, to pull me into the truth whether I was ready or not. When he stood to leave, I almost reached out, almost stopped him, but the words died in my throat. I stayed late, the office dark and empty around me. I opened the email again, my cursor hovering over the delete button. It would be so easy to make it disappear, to pretend it had never come, but I couldn't. Instead, I flagged it, moving it into a folder, a secret within a secret. The screen glowed in the dim light, the words etched into my memory, a quiet echo in the silence. When I finally left, the air outside was cool, a breeze brushing against my skin. I walked to my car, my steps slow, my mind a whirl of possibilities. As I slid behind the wheel, my phone buzzed. A new message. My breath caught, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. It was from a colleague, a reminder about a meeting. Relief washed over me, sharp and sudden, leaving me lightheaded. The drive home was a blur of headlights and dark roads. My hands gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, the pendant around my neck a cool weight against my skin. I felt the metal press into me, a reminder of everything I had to lose. When I reached the house, the windows were dark, the porch light casting long shadows. My husband was working late, the emptiness of the house both a comfort and a warning. I sat on the porch steps, the wood cool beneath me, and let the night wrap around me. I needed to think, to find a way forward, to unravel the knot of fear and guilt that had settled deep inside me. The email was a door, a crack through which the truth could slip, and I had no way of knowing who stood on the other side. Hours passed, the stars wheeling overhead, the world turning around me. When my husband's car pulled into the driveway, I forced myself to stand, to slip back into the role I had been playing for so long. He kissed my cheek, his lips warm, his presence solid and unchanging. I held on to him a little too long, the pressure of his arms around me both a comfort and a cage. And as we walked inside, the door closing behind us, I felt the weight of the secret pressing down, the shadow of that email a constant presence. I didn't know who knew or how much they had seen, but I knew that the fragile balance I had built was beginning to crumble. And in the quiet of the house, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards, I heard the ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when everything would finally break. The days dragged on with a kind of oppressive slowness, each hour stretching into the next, the weight of the anonymous message a constant pressure against my ribs. I moved through my routines as if on autopilot, my actions detached from the thoughts swirling beneath the surface. Every email that appeared in my inbox sent a jolt through my system, a surge of adrenaline that left my hands trembling and my breath shallow. But no follow-up message came, and the silence around it only deepened the fear. At home, my husband began to notice the shift. He watched me with quiet concern, his brow furrowed as if trying to decipher a language he no longer understood. He asked me if I was okay, his voice soft, his touch gentle, and I lied to him with practiced ease. I told him it was work, the stress of deadlines, the weight of responsibilities. He nodded, accepting my words, but his gaze lingered on me, a question he wasn't sure how to ask. One evening as I was washing dishes, he came up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist. His touch was warm, familiar, a reminder of the life we had built together. I leaned into him, allowing myself a moment of comfort, but even as I did, I felt the distance between us. It was like standing on opposite sides of a chasm, our hands reaching across the void, fingers brushing but never truly connecting. "Let's go away this weekend," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. "Just us. No work, no phones. We could use a break." My first instinct was to say no, to pull away, to find an excuse. But the exhaustion in his voice, the quiet plea beneath his words, made me pause. I nodded, setting the plate down, the water still running over my hands. "Hey, I'd like that." His relief was palpable, a soft exhale against my skin. He kissed my cheek, his lips lingering, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to feel something, anything beyond the cold weight of my own secrets. We left early Saturday morning, the car packed with overnight bags and a picnic basket. He chose a small bed and breakfast by the lake, a quaint place with whitewashed walls and wildflowers spilling over the edges of garden beds. The air was cool, the sky a soft gray, and I felt a fleeting hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a way back to him, to us. We walked along the water, our feet sinking into the damp earth, the world around us wrapped in the quiet hum of nature. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and for a moment I let myself be pulled into his rhythm. We talked about nothing and everything, the kind of conversation that ebbed and flowed, comfortable and easy. But beneath the surface, the current pulled at me, a quiet reminder of the truth I couldn't escape. At dinner, he ordered a bottle of wine, his smile soft as he poured us each a glass. The candlelight flickered between us, casting long shadows on the rustic wooden table. He told stories from work, small anecdotes that usually made me laugh, but I found myself nodding along, my responses hollow. I wanted to be present, to give him the version of me he deserved, but my mind wandered, my thoughts tangled in the words of that email, the echo of a truth I couldn't let him see. When we returned to our room, the bed large and inviting, he pulled me close. His touch was gentle, his hands moving over me with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. I wanted to lose myself in him, to let his love wash away the shadows, but my body moved through the motions while my mind remained distant. When he whispered my name, his voice thick with emotion, I bit my lip, holding back the sob that threatened to break free. Afterward, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and steady, a metronome to my restless thoughts. I lay beside him, my back to his warmth, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The room was too quiet, the silence pressing down on me, each breath a reminder of the walls closing in. I slipped out of bed, the floor cool beneath my feet, and moved to the window. The lake stretched out in the darkness, a sheet of ink beneath the moonlight, the surface still and unyielding. My phone sat on the nightstand, its screen dark, a small, silent weight. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the smooth glass, and opened my email. The message was still there, buried in the folder where I had hidden it, the words waiting for me. I read it again, the familiarity of the threat settling over me like a shroud. I had hoped the distance, the time away, might dull the edge of my fear, but it remained sharp, a knife pressed against my skin. I closed the phone, the screen going black, my reflection staring back at me, a woman I barely recognized. The ache in my chest swelled, a pressure building beneath my ribs, and I pressed my palm against the glass, the coolness of it grounding me. I wanted to run, to flee from the weight of my choices, but there was nowhere to go, no path that didn't lead back to this moment. When I returned to bed, my husband shifted in his sleep, his arm draping over me, pulling me close. His warmth should have been a comfort, but it only made the emptiness inside me more profound. I lay still, my breath shallow, my body curled into itself, and waited for morning to come, the gray light of dawn a promise of nothing more than another day of the same. And as the first rays of light slipped through the window, I knew that something had to break. The tension, the secrets, the quiet unraveling of my life. It couldn't go on. Whether it was the truth, the lie, or me, something had to give. And as I lay there, wrapped in the arms of a man who still believed I was his, I felt the edge of that truth cut into me, sharp and undeniable. The morning light was a pale wash over the room, softening the edges of the furniture, turning everything into a quiet dreamscape. I lay still, my husband's arm draped over me, his breath warm against the back of my neck. His embrace should have been a comfort, a reminder of stability and love, but it felt like a shackle, a weight pressing down on me, pinning me to a life I no longer recognized as my own. I slipped out of bed carefully, the mattress barely shifting. His hand slid from my waist, fingers brushing the sheets as if in protest, but he didn't wake. I moved to the bathroom, closing the door softly, the click of the latch a fragile barrier between us. The mirror reflected a version of me I barely knew, hair tousled, eyes shadowed with fatigue, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. I reached up, fingers grazing the pendant resting against my collarbone, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat beneath my skin. The silver leaf, delicate and intricate, had become a talisman of sorts, a secret I carried close, a reminder of another life waiting just beyond the edges of this one. I held it between my fingers, the chain biting into my skin, and felt the weight of every choice, every lie, every moment where I had stepped closer to the edge. When I stepped back into the room, my husband was awake, his eyes half closed, a lazy smile stretching over his lips. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own voice distant, a hollow echo. I moved through the motions, dressing, brushing my hair, packing our bags, my hands steady even as the rest of me trembled beneath the surface. We had breakfast on the porch of the bed and breakfast, the world around us wrapped in a misty gray. The lake stretched out before us, its surface still and glassy, reflecting the sky. My husband talked about plans for the day, his voice a gentle hum that I barely heard. My mind wandered, drifting over the possibilities, the paths my life might take if I let it. On the drive back, I sat with my head against the window, the cool glass a balm against my fevered thoughts. The world rushed by, a blur of green and gray, and I felt a strange detachment, as if I were floating outside of myself, watching from a distance. My husband's hand rested on my thigh, a gentle, absent-minded touch that once would have sent a warmth through me. Now it felt like a reminder of the chains binding me to the past. When we reached home, the house seemed smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. I unpacked our bags, moving through the rooms like a ghost. My husband settled into his familiar routines, the television casting soft light over the living room, the sound of a sports announcer filling the silence. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. And then, as if pulled by an invisible string, I reached for my phone. The screen glowed in my hand, a portal to the world beyond this one, to the life I had built in the shadows. I opened my email, my fingers moving with a practiced ease, and there it was, the message. "I know about you and him." I stared at the words, letting them seep into me, cold and sharp. They were a threat, a promise, a window into the truth I had been avoiding. And in that moment I knew that the only way forward was through. Through the fear, through the guilt, through the tangled mess of my own making. I had to face it, had to let the truth unravel no matter where it led. I moved to the living room, my phone clutched in my hand, my pulse thundering in my ears. My husband looked up, his expression soft, a question in his eyes. "Everything okay?" I opened my mouth, but the words stuck, lodged in my throat. The weight of them pressed against me, a physical thing, and I felt myself breaking under it. "We need to talk." His smile faded, his posture shifting, a tension threading through his body. "About what?" I sat down, the cushion sagging beneath me, the room suddenly too small, the air too thick. "About us. About what I've done." He didn't speak, didn't move, but I saw the change in his eyes. A subtle shift, the slow unraveling of understanding. I told him everything. The words came in a rush, spilling over each other, raw and unpolished. I told him about the kiss, about the moments stolen in the quiet of the office, about the email, the weight of the lie I had carried for so long. He sat still, his hands folded in his lap, his knuckles white against his skin. His breathing was steady, too steady, a forced control that scared me more than if he had shouted. When I finished, the silence fell heavy around us, a shroud over the room. He stood, his movements slow, deliberate, and turned away, his back a wall between us. "I need some time," he said finally, his voice low, every syllable precise. "I need to think." I nodded, but he didn't see it. He moved down the hall, his steps soft, each one a nail in the coffin of what we had been. I sat alone, the room awash of shadows, my phone still in my hand, the screen dark. The truth lay between us, raw and exposed, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. That night, I slept on the couch, the cushions hard and unyielding, the blanket a poor shield against the cold. I drifted in and out of sleep, my dreams a tangled mess of faces and voices, echoes of the life I had broken. When morning came, the light was sharp, piercing through the curtains, cutting through the remnants of the night. My husband was gone. His keys were missing from the hook, his jacket no longer draped over the chair. I sat up, the blanket pooling around me, the house settling into a heavy silence. I didn't know where he had gone or if he would come back, but I knew that this was the first step. The first crack in the walls I had built, the first breath of air in the stifling room of my own making. I stood, the pendant resting against my skin, a cool reminder of the path that had led me here. I didn't know where to go, what to do, but for the first time the weight of the truth felt lighter. And as I stepped into the morning light, the world still turning, the air still sharp, I knew that whatever came next, it would be real. It would be mine.